Hi, class. Today we will be talking about chapter 3 with it, which is ethics and behavioral research. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So this chapter, I think, is extremely important and important for numerous reasons. But the most important reason is because when we do research on human subjects, there is a really great responsibility that we have to our participants, to ensuring that we are adhering to ethical practices and guidelines, but also to ensure that we are not putting our participants in any sort of risk. So I have posted a link to Milgram's famous obedience study. I hope you'll take a moment to take a look at that study. Now, this is an example of gray areas, right? So when the study was first created, I don't think that anybody actually thought that it was going to cause any amount of harm. In fact, the idea of this study was to take a look at the phenomenon of obedience, particularly thinking about Nazi Germany and how individuals were able to behave in what outwardly looked like very callous ways. The research community wanted to understand why that was happening. And so this is where that study of obedience came into play. And so Milgram really wanted to study the effects of punishment and what happened if a person dressed in a white lab coat who looked like an authority figure asked you to please continue. The study must go on. And how much people would be willing to shock a person that they didn't even know up until something very clearly labeled death, right? An electric shock that would induce death. And we actually found that a good majority of people were willing to do this. However, the outcome was people didn't know that they were doing this study, and it really caused, for many, kind of this internal feeling of harm, right? That they were harming somebody else, and they had to kind of deal with that. So there are times where we conduct what we would think is a benign research study, and at that point it becomes, when is it the researcher's responsibility to sort of pull back and stop this from happening? So human experimentation is not something that's new. Unfortunately, in our history, we've actually used human experimentation in times of war. So during World War II, individuals were experimented on while being held in concentration camps. Things like freezing an individual to see if we could treat hypothermia, giving people seawater to see if it was drinkable, right? Seawater is filled with a bunch of salt. Looking at malaria, infecting people with malaria, and seeing if there was a way for us to effectively treat it. After this happened and the public found out about it, there was outrage. Same outrage I hope you're feeling right now. In fact, 12 military trials were held for the leaders who committed these war crimes. And from this actually came what's called the Nuremberg Code. So in 1947, we had the Nuremberg Code. And the main principles of this is that participants should be given an informed consent. They should not be coerced into being in the study. And the benefit to the participant should actually outweigh the costs. So this was a step forward. We actually felt really good about this. Right now we're hopefully laying out principles to treat our participants ethically. And then we had the Tuskegee syphilis study. This occurred between 1932 and 1972. That's a huge amount of time. There were 399 sharecroppers that were a part of this study, and it took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. Most of the sharecroppers were African American, and they already had syphilis. And this is important because in 1932, we didn't really know that much about syphilis. All we knew was that if a person got syphilis, that means they had bad blood. And at that time, they didn't have any effective treatments. And so the researchers in this study offered free medical care, treatments for the people who had syphilis, rides to the clinic, meals, burial insurance. And remember, at the time, there was no cure for syphilis. And people who got syphilis died. And so at the beginning of this study, this sort of compensation, if you will, seemed really great. In fact, we know that the treatments at the time were toxic, they were dangerous, and we didn't actually even know if they were effective. So what ended up happening is clinicians wanted to see whether individuals would be better off with no treatment at all. So they didn't provide treatment for these participants. Now remember, at the beginning of the study, we had no treatment at all. But then, in 1947, penicillin became the standard treatment. In fact, if you were to contract syphilis today, you could take penicillin you would get a prescription from your doctor and you would be fine. You take that round of antibiotics and you would be fine. But this is where we failed. Individuals were still not given the treatment even after penicillin was the known standard of treatment. In fact, the clinicians continued the study in order to see how the disease spread and eventually killed people. Remember, we now have a treatment and we weren't providing that treatment to participants. In 1979, this led to the Belmont Report. And this study was one of the worst studies that we have had as a part of our history. And the Belmont Report outlines 3 basic ethical principles, and they are beneficence. This is that research should confer benefits and the risk must be minimal. We should have respect for persons or autonomy, which is that respect for persons. Participants are capable of making decisions about whether to participate in research. And justice. There must be fairness in receiving the benefits of research as well as sharing the burdens of accepting risks. We also have the APA Ethics Code that was formed later. Remember, APA is the American Psychological Association. It's who has the book that we talked about with our citations, right? And this applies to psychologists in their roles. Principles here also include beneficence, the need for research to maximize benefits and minimize harm. Fidelity and responsibility. Psychologists have to establish a relationship of trust with the people that they are working with. So the participants should know that they can trust the researcher, that the researcher will not put them in harm's way. Integrity. So psychologists should seek to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in the science, teaching, and practicing of psychology. They shouldn't steal and cheat or engage in any fraud or misinterpretation of data, which is very important. Justice. So psychologists recognize that fairness and justice are entitled to all individuals. This includes access to the benefit from its contribution to psychology. We shouldn't be just taking research and sitting it on shelves. We should be able to do something with that. And then finally, our respect for persons. And here, thinking about that respect for persons, respect the dignity and worth of every individual and the right of every individual, and that we should provide safeguards for individuals as they are participating in that research. We also need to make sure that we're eliminating any bias that we might have in our work, right? We'll kind of talk about some different study designs coming up and how some of those study designs can help us eliminate some of that bias. When you are conducting a research study, you should always be able to have a risk-benefit analysis. Basically, it boils down to this. A participant should be no worse off for being a part of your research study. If they will experience any kind of harm, and it is more than they would experience in kind of everyday life, then you need to go back and relook at your study. We need to think about whether or not that study really needs to be conducted, and if in fact it will provide good for the research community, right? So thinking about any research study that you do as a researcher, I always say this: if the participant is no worse off, they should be no worse off for having participated in your study. That's kind of the bottom line. We also need to think about the benefits for being a part of that research, right? So it's not just the risk associated to the participant, but what's the benefit, right? What are we getting from this research study? Are we able to educate people on a new skill? Are we, providing some kind of treatment? This is really important. All participants, before they begin any research study, are provided with something known as an informed consent. This is a form that outlines what the research will consist of, what you can kind of expect. It also outlines the benefits to you or the benefits to society at large. And it also gives you numbers to contact for the researcher in case you ever have a question that you'd like to ask them at a later time. Every IRB approved research study has to have an informed consent. If that informed consent does not exist, we need to question whether or not that has gone through a thorough vetting process. Another key important part of an informed consent form relates to the confidentiality. When anybody completes a research study, your information should be confidential. You should be able to answer the surveys or take part in the research without the risk of other people being aware of what it is that you answered or how you answered. And so your consent form should also outline this confidentiality as well. The informed consent will also go over the ability for the participant to withdraw from the study. You should never hold a person hostage. They should be able to withdraw from the study at any time. Children under the age of 18 cannot give consent, right, because they're under 18, but they can give something called assent. So parents would have to provide consent for their child under 18 And then the child also gets to assent to participating in the study. Coercion should never happen in a research study. So you cannot provide individuals something to make sure that they participate in this study. And what that means is, and let me actually kind of back up, I can provide you with a benefit. So I could say, here's a gift card for participating in my research. However, if you withdraw because let's say that you started answering the questions and you've experienced some trauma and it's bringing back some of that trauma for you, you should still be eligible for the gift card, even if you did not complete the research study. What I can't do is say, hey, I have this research study. If you do it, you can have extra credit, right? You might feel that because I am your professor that you have to do it. And that's that feeling of coercion, right? So we cannot provide that coercion. So you shouldn't actually be provided with extra credit from any of your faculty for doing their particular research study. Now, a faculty member could offer you research extra credit if you also have another way to earn that extra credit. So in many universities, there's the subject pool. Intro to Psych students have to complete, 6 hours of participating in research. Now, if I don't want to participate in the research, I can earn my 6 credit hours by completing reviews of research studies or something like that, right? So there should be some equivalent to earning those credits or earning that extra credit or earning those points, whatever they may be. There can be some information withheld from a consent form, particularly if deception is taking place. One thing for us to consider and sort of talk about is whether or not deception is ethical. And so I look forward to kind of hearing what your thoughts are on that. But even if you did provide deception to your participants, at the end of every research study, a person should be debriefed. And during this time, participants should be talked through what happened in the research and, why that deception took place. And I can kind of talk you through step-down debriefing a little bit if you are ever interested in learning about it. Essentially, debriefing occurs so that participants leave the experiment without any ill feelings towards the field of psychology. So they should walk away kind of knowing what happened in the research, why that took place. And also, this is an opportunity for the researcher to explain the purpose of the study, what the anticipated results are. And again, generally making sure that the participant walks away feeling very positive about the research experience. So this gives you a brief overview of kind of where we started with ethics and some of the things that are expected whenever you complete a research study. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video clip here. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any additional questions. All right. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a good one. Bye.